At dawn, on the 13th of October, 1974, Stephen Crawford, the security guard, shattered the solemn silence of Stanford University's Memorial Church. It was supposed to be just another routine patroller, so he thought. But as soon as he opened the door, he was not greeted by the scent of candles and incense, but by the stench of death. On one of the front pews, directly in front of the altar, lay the body of a young woman in a pool of dried blood. This was not just a murder. It was a diabolical message, a violent ritual designed to desecrate the holiest of places. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was not only who did this, but why. The most terrifying answer was hiding in plain sight all along. At 5:45 a.m., Stephen Crawford, the church's security guard, arrived for his usual shift. When he opened the church door, he was confronted with a horrific scene. Near the altar, on the first pew, Arlis Perry lay in a pool of dried blood. She was found half naked. Her jeans were torn, removed from her body, and discarded nearby. Her arms remained crossed over her chest in a prayer-like position, her legs spread apart. It was believed she had been raped. The apparent cause of death was an ice pick protruding from her head on the left side. The handle was broken, likely because the perpetrator tried to pull it out after the killing but failed. In addition to this injury, Arlis's neck was broken. The killer had raped her with a candle, approximately 1 meter long, taken from the church. A foreign object was left in her body. Another similar candle was placed in her hands on her chest. It appeared as though she had been assaulted, with deliberate attempts to humiliate her as much as possible. This was why her body was left in that position. A palm print was found on a nearby candle. It was believed to belong to the perpetrator, and male biological fluids were discovered on the victim's body. There were no signs of a struggle or corresponding injuries on the victim. The perpetrator likely struck her immediately, causing her to lose consciousness and rendering her unable to resist. There were bruises and abrasions on her face from the beating, as well as strangulation marks on her neck. The autopsy confirmed these suspicions. The first blow the young woman received was from an ice pick to the head. After that, she was no longer able to resist, but the perpetrator did not stop. He tortured and raped her. This crime was unimaginably brutal, but who was this young woman whose life ended in such a horrific way? Arlis Perry was born on the 22nd of February, 1955, and was the youngest of 3 children in her family. They all lived in the small town of Linton, North Dakota, USA. The family was deeply religious, to the extent that her father even founded a church in the new town they moved to, Bismarck, North Dakota. The girl's family was wealthy, owning a car dealership. Everyone who knew Arlis described her as deeply religious, kind-hearted, and profoundly empathetic, bordering on naivety. She willingly helped anyone who, in her view, needed support. It seemed as though she considered helping others her life's mission. She even taught Sunday school and was a member of the church youth group. Otherwise, she was a typical teenager. In high school, she participated in cheerleading. Arlis was athletic, regularly attending sporting events in her hometown, and at one such event, she met a young man named Bruce Perry. He was born into a large, respectable family and had lived his entire life in Bismarck. He was known as a rising star in track and field. The two young people met and immediately began dating. According to all their friends, they were the perfect couple. They almost never argued, and if disagreements arose, they were always over trivial matters and quickly resolved. Arlis and Bruce were the same age. In 1973, they graduated from high school and continued their relationship. Soon, the young man, who wanted to follow in his doctor father's footsteps, was accepted into the medical school at Stanford University in California. Arlis decided to stay in her hometown to pursue an education at a local college. Life circumstances and the desire to build a future career separated them. It was an extremely difficult period for the couple. Nevertheless, the young lovers maintained a long-distance relationship, hoping things would work out in the future. After his first year, Bruce returned to Bismarck and said he could not continue like this. The separation from his beloved was unbearable. He did not want to return to Stanford without Arlis. He proposed to her. They married at the age of 19. Not wanting to miss the opportunity to graduate from the prestigious Stanford University, he took his young wife with him. He returned for his second year with her. Arlis decided to drop out of school but planned to work to support her husband. Initially, she took a job as an administrator in a university building designated for newlywed students. During this period, Bruce studied and worked full-time. As a result, his 19-year-old bride spent most of her time alone. During this time, she felt somewhat lonely, as she rarely left the campus. Even when Bruce was with her, he was preoccupied with his studies. At the time, Bruce felt quite comfortable. Thanks to the university, he had a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. Arlis adapted to the feelings of loneliness and isolation, by convincing herself that once Bruce graduated, everything would change. However, the young woman stayed in constant contact with her family and said she felt like an outsider in California. She had previously lived in Bismarck, where everyone knew each other, so the bustling, large city was a mixed experience. After a month, the situation in California changed. Unable to bear the isolation any longer, Arlis found a permanent job at a law firm and became a secretary. The changes had a positive effect on Arlis, who had few friends among the students on campus. Now she could go out into the city and interact with people, something she had been missing. The tone of her letters to loved ones also changed. If she had previously written to her family about how difficult life was in California, she now began to love the place. She made friends, allowing her to socialize and go out in her free time. She fell even more in love with the city when she discovered Stanford's church. Arlis was a devout young woman, seeking solace in her faith. On the night before her body was discovered, she did exactly what she was accustomed to doing. On Saturday, the 12th of October, 1974, Bruce and Arlis were together for most of the day. The young man was preparing for classes and work, while his girlfriend was simply bored, being on her day off. Around 11:30 p.m., she said she wanted to go for a walk and visit the mailbox to send letters to her family. Given the late hour, Bruce was wary of letting Arlis go alone, so he joined her. It was planned as a short walk around the campus. During it, they argued briefly about tire pressure, but Arlis calmed down. She said she wanted to be alone and asked Bruce to return to the dorm and wait for her there. Her husband was reluctant to let her go and asked where she intended to wander at such a late hour. She replied that she wanted to be alone in the church to pray. Despite the late hour, Bruce had to agree, as he did not want to escalate the dispute. In any case, his wife was supposed to return within half an hour at the latest. By 11:50 p.m., he had already returned home, and at that time, Arlis had just entered Stanford Church. She had only 10 minutes to pray, as everything closed for the night at 12 o'clock. There were few people there, but they all saw the girl who came to pray, unusually late. The others left the church on time. At 12 o'clock, the church security guard was supposed to inspect everything before locking the doors. However, he did not check all the rooms, merely poking his head inside the door and asking if anyone was there. When no one responded, he quietly locked everything and left. But what happened in those final 10 minutes? And how did the security guard see nothing? These questions would perplex investigators for decades to come. After Arlis left her husband Bruce to head toward the church, Bruce had no idea that those moments would turn into a nightmare that would haunt him for years. Bruce, like his wife, was a regular churchgoer, so he knew well that it closed at midnight, and his young wife was expected to return home, but she didn't, and the husband grew anxious. By 12:30 a.m., Bruce was so worried about Arlis's absence that he decided to go to the church and search for her himself. The situation felt deeply troubling, so he was prepared to accept any mistake, as long as she was safe at home. The young man walked quickly, and within a few minutes, he was at the church. He checked all the accessible doors, looked through the windows, and realized everything was locked. Bruce tried to peer inside, but with the lights off, he couldn't see anything. Thinking that Arlis might have been accidentally locked inside, he knocked on the windows, but there was no response. Bruce continued searching throughout Stanford's campus, but even by 3 a.m., he found no trace of his wife. He decided she might have returned home, but when he reached the dorm for newlyweds, he realized he was mistaken. The young man didn't sleep all night, waiting for Arlis's return, calling all their friends, and roaming the campus multiple times, checking every possible place she might be. His anxiety reached its peak. Around 4 a.m., Bruce ran to the church again to check on his wife, but it was still locked, so he called the police, reporting her missing. However, the police didn't take the report seriously, as Arlis had only been missing for a few hours. Despite his insistence that such behavior was unlike her, the officers were skeptical and simply tried to calm him down. As a precaution, they spoke with him and gathered information. But the investigators soon noticed something that immediately made him a suspect. While talking to Bruce, the police observed blood on his clothes, a significant amount of it. He explained that severe anxiety often caused him to have intense nosebleeds, which had started while he was searching for his wife due to his distress. Bruce eventually convinced the police that his wife needed to be rescued from the locked church. They went there to investigate. At the scene, they immediately noted that the building was securely locked. The officers shone their lights into the windows but saw no signs of anyone inside. All the doors were closed. They calmed Bruce, telling him they would have to wait until the church opened, which wasn't far off, and sent him back to the campus to rest, as he appeared exhausted. The officers themselves returned to the station to await news, occupied with other matters. At that time, they didn't yet attach much importance to Arlis's disappearance, and were confident she would return later that morning on her own. After the discovery of the girl's body, the police decided not to inform her husband of her death immediately. Instead, they first invited Bruce for a standard interrogation that lasted 2 hours. The reason for this approach by law enforcement was suspicion. From the beginning, Bruce seemed a potential killer, primarily due to the extreme brutality inflicted on the victim. There were suspicions that the blood on his clothes was indeed his wife's. It was believed he might know more than he was saying. There were also speculations about possible motives: a quarrel, infidelity, or an unplanned pregnancy. Any of these could have provoked the young man to such savagery. During the interrogation, the police pretended they were still searching for the girl and unaware of what had happened to her. They tried to discern the nature of the couple's relationship. Bruce was cooperative, answering all the investigators' questions, providing his fingerprints, and agreeing to take a polygraph test. So, was Bruce, the grieving husband, ultimately the killer? The materials were immediately compared with the palm print found on the candle. No matches were found. Moreover, the young man passed the polygraph test with ease. After this, there were practically no doubts left. He was removed from the list of suspects. If it wasn't Bruce, who could have committed this heinous crime? The list of suspects wasn't long, but it held some surprises. After Bruce Perry was cleared of suspicion, attention turned to another individual who was present at the church that night. The second, and most obvious, suspect was the security guard, Stephen Crawford, who was among the last to see the girl alive and the one who discovered her body. The security guard recalled her arriving at the church just 10 minutes before closing. During questioning, it was established that he did not inspect the church before closing as required, but merely poked his head inside and asked if anyone was present. When no one responded, he locked the building. By this time, 20 minutes had passed since Arlis's arrival at the church. He assumed she had already left with the other visitors. Initially, Stephen insisted he had thoroughly checked everything, fearing trouble for not following protocol. The longer the police spoke with him, the more evident certain gaps and inconsistencies in his account became. Because part of his story was found to be fabricated, suspicions were partially confirmed. Stephen was an eccentric individual. Some investigators believed he was simply trying to deflect blame for his negligence, which led to the girl's death. There were also opposing views on this theory. His behavior seemed particularly suspicious when he was asked to provide fingerprints and undergo a polygraph test. He was uncooperative. However, with some pressure, Stephen provided his fingerprints and passed the lie detector test successfully. After comparing them to the print on the candle, the police were convinced there were no matches, but even the security guard was not the final lead in this mysterious case. According to Stephen, after discovering the girl's body inside the church, he went around and checked all the doors. One was slightly ajar. Upon closer inspection, he found it had been opened from the inside. This seemed strange because the police had arrived at the church shortly before it opened, walked around the building, and confirmed all doors were locked. Could the perpetrator have been inside for several hours at that moment, waiting for an opportune moment to escape, and left the church only after the police had departed? Investigators tried to identify everyone present in the church. According to their calculations, there were 7 people in Stanford Church on the night of the 12th of October, 13. Among them were Arlis and the guard. 4 other parishioners were identified, questioned, and eliminated from the suspect list. The identity of the 7th man remained unknown. A passerby described the young man as being about to enter the church around midnight. He was of medium build, approximately 180 centimeters tall, with blonde hair. Another witness said that, while passing by the church at 12:20 a.m., he heard a strange noise coming from inside. When he stopped to listen, the noise stopped abruptly. Investigators appealed to the public to come forward for investigation regarding the 7th person's involvement in the murder, but no one responded to the request. After questioning Arlis's colleagues at work, it emerged that 2 days before the tragedy, an unfamiliar blonde young man visited her workplace. They spoke privately for a few minutes before parting. After this conversation, Arlis seemed upset, but no one knew the man's name or could describe him accurately. With conflicting testimonies and a lack of definitive evidence, rumors began to spread like wildfire, and the case took an even stranger turn. The extreme brutality displayed by the killer didn't only affect the victim. It was alleged that he was attempting to use religious objects to mock and harm the church as much as he harmed the girl. It seemed as though he had something against the church and wanted to undermine people's faith. One of the priests who saw the mutilated body concluded that what had happened was a satanic ritual. This rumor was quickly picked up by others. Speculation spread that this was a sign of growing involvement in satanic cults. Not only did the public show great interest in this horrific case, but journalists did as well, whose activities made it impossible to stop the various speculations. Some suggested that Arlis was trying to persuade a local satanic cult. As a result, a conflict arose, which is why she was dealt with so cruelly. The spread of these rumors had a negative impact on the investigation's progress and confused everyone. The police did everything they could to stop the spread of gossip, but the volume of falsehoods was so great that some even supported the idea that law enforcement agencies themselves were under the control of Satanists and involved in this activity. Arlis's family suffered the most from these speculations. Relatives tried to stop the spread of rumors, believing they tarnished their daughter's memory. These were not just fleeting rumors. The crime itself seemed like a satanic ritual. Strange events continued after the girl's funeral, held in Bismarck, where her family lived. A temporary headstone was placed on her grave, but it was stolen in the first few days after her body was buried. To many, this seemed clear evidence that a satanic cult was indeed involved. People believed Arlis's killer had personally come to Bismarck and intended to stalk the victim's family. However, law enforcement authorities did not take these ideas seriously. It was believed that any resident of the town could have stolen the headstone due to the high-profile nature of the crime. Amid these horrifying theories, the authorities tried to find a more rational explanation. Against this backdrop, rumors of a satanic cult's involvement seemed increasingly credible, prompting the decision to contact the FBI. Criminal profilers were tasked with creating a psychological profile of the man who committed the attack. At this stage, it was not ruled out that a cult and an entire group of people might have been involved in the massacre, but the FBI's findings were quite the opposite. According to the profile, the attack was carried out by a single man, aged between 20 and 30. He was a loner, possibly with ties to military service. The crime was believed to be a hate crime, potentially committed by an aspiring serial killer. The perpetrator likely took a memento from Arlis, perhaps a lock of hair or something small she had with her. This would allow the killer to relive the emotions experienced during the crime. This man's profile matched the habits of a serial killer, but no such individual was found in the area. Years passed, and suspicions began to swirl around some of the country's most notorious killers, even those operating far from California. Those invested in the case tried to link Arlis's death to every prominent maniac and serial killer who operated in the United States after her death in the church. For example, journalist Arlis Perry investigated numerous brutal crime cases in detail. Years later, a maniac emerged to terrorize New York. He called himself the Son of Sam. This was David Berkowitz. When caught, he claimed his first crime was coerced by his neighbor's dog, which ordered him to kill. He later changed his story, claiming he did not act alone, but was part of a satanic cult. However, his plans changed several times. According to Berkowitz, he joined a group of Satanists in the spring of 1975 and committed his first murder with accomplices in 1979. 5 years after Arlis's death, he sent a book about the occult to the Bismarck police, highlighting several passages he deemed most significant. When David Berkowitz was sent to prison, he made several sensational confessions, including taking responsibility for Arlis Perry's murder. He claimed the satanic cult he joined carried out the massacre. It was a ritualistic group murder aimed at tarnishing the church's reputation. However, during the investigation, it was proven he did not participate in this killing, and all the information he provided to the police had been covered by the media in some way. Some of it was false information Berkowitz tried to exploit to gain more notoriety. Later, the criminal's lie about the satanic cult he claimed to be part of was exposed. In reality, it was all fabricated. Despite this, Arlis Perry believed it was true. He was well versed in Berkowitz's crimes, studied all his cases, and saw a common pattern with Arlis's murder. At the same time, the journalist was certain that the Son of Sam killings and Arlis's massacre could not have been committed by the same person. Terry believed an entire network of satanic cults was spreading across the United States, carrying out the bloodiest and most brutal murders. He compiled his theory into a book published under the title, The Ultimate Evil. He agreed with law enforcement that David Berkowitz could not have killed Arlis because his fingerprints did not match the palm print found near the victim, but he was convinced someone from the cult was involved. Perhaps it was the blonde satanic young man who visited the workplace of his future victim. Terry believed the police were making a significant mistake by dismissing the idea of satanic involvement in the girl's murder. However, not everyone supported him, believing Terry was simply trying to gain fame through high-profile crimes. Another notorious killer, Ted Bundy, was questioned by the police in this case. He was a frequent visitor to California in 1974 and committed horrific attacks, but he was quickly ruled out as a suspect because his alibi was confirmed. Dozens of men, including church visitors and priests, were questioned, but they were all eliminated one by one based on the evidence collected at the crime scene. In particular, none of their fingerprints matched the palm print. The perpetrator was never found. The case reached a dead end for years. Would this case remain an eternal mystery, or would time bring answers no one expected? After years of investigation and rumors, the case had reached a dead end. The perpetrator was never found. The case stalled for years. For nearly half a century, it was impossible to determine who could have so brutally mutilated an innocent and devout young woman. Journalistic speculation and assumptions by interested parties did not lead to any progress in the investigation. Sometimes, acts of aggression are so surprising and unpredictable that establishing a connection between the assailant and the victim is nearly impossible. This allows highly dangerous individuals to live normal lives unpunished for years, sometimes even decades, enjoying a life of freedom, as happened in our story today. Was the perpetrator walking free, living his life while the victim's family suffered in torment? Rumors and gossip significantly hindered the investigation. Investigators received hundreds of dubious tips, verifying which only delayed the process. As police dismissed one public suggestion after another and began ignoring repeated claims, people started to believe that law enforcement agencies were indeed ineffective. There were several attempts to blame the police for their incompetence, which allowed the killer to remain free. Arlis's family suffered the most from these speculations. Little did anyone know that those long years of silence were hiding the truth in plain sight. For over 4 decades, the murder of Arlis Perry remained a baffling mystery, but modern technology held the key to solving it. The mystery of Arlis Perry's death was solved with the help of cutting-edge forensic techniques. In 2016, a team of investigators was formed to work on unsolved cases. A group of experts re-examined the existing evidence and immediately discovered that the initial investigators had misclassified some evidence. Specifically, traces of biological fluids found on Arlis's pants were initially thought to belong to her husband, Bruce. However, DNA testing revealed they did not belong to him. This pivotal finding completely shifted the investigation's direction. If it wasn't Bruce, then who was it? The 2 original primary suspects in the case were re-examined, with the focus now on the security guard, Stephen Crawford. The former security guard appeared highly suspicious. This was compared to a profile compiled by the FBI after the crime. The similarities were striking. Stephen was indeed a 30-year-old man at the time. He was also a loner with a military background, a former U.S. Air Force veteran. After returning from service, he aspired to a career in law enforcement and initially succeeded, but his dreams were shattered. A year later, a new police chief arrived, and Stephen was demoted. As a result, he began working as a simple security guard at the church. Due to these changes, he was bitter and spoke negatively about what had happened and about the new chief. Many of the young man's friends heard him threaten revenge. After Arlis's death, Stephen continued working at the church for another 2 years before finally leaving. He then worked as a security guard at Stanford University. As it turned out, in 1992, his ex-wife went to the police, claiming he had stolen valuable photos and books from his workplace, which could be considered ancient artifacts. Specifically, leather-bound Latin texts from the 15th century disappeared from the anthropology department. These items were deemed highly valuable. When attempts were made to recover them, it emerged that Stephen had stolen them simply because he liked antiques. For this crime, he received 2 years of probation. His behavior was deeply concerning, but the technological limitations of the time led the investigation to a dead end. But now, with modern techniques, there was no place left to hide. Armed with new evidence, law enforcement approached Stephen again in 2016. Due to new developments in the case, the police needed a DNA sample from the man for comparison, but the former security guard refused to provide one. The man had no prior convictions for violent crimes and lived a quiet, peaceful life. Stephen was invited to the police station for a conversation several times. On one occasion, he threw away a water bottle after speaking with investigators. They retrieved it and were able to obtain a DNA profile from the saliva on the bottle's neck. It was compared to the biological fluids found on Arlis's pants. The test showed a perfect match. At that moment, the former security guard was 74 years old. Unlike the innocent victim, he had lived a full life. 44 years had passed since her death. After 44 years of silence and relentless searching, the final thread had led investigators to the true culprit. The time for justice had come, but would it be complete? An arrest warrant was issued immediately. When officers arrived at his apartment to arrest him at 9 a.m. on the 20th of June, 2018, Stephen Crawford requested time to get dressed. They granted him this concession, but even after several minutes, he had not emerged and refused to open the door again. The police approached the landlord, who provided his personal key to allow the investigator entry. There, they found Stephen in bed, holding a handgun and threatening to shoot. The officers retreated to regroup and decide what to do, but the situation resolved itself. Minutes after they left the apartment, a single shot rang out. Stephen Crawford had taken his own life. The killer escaped the final confrontation, but he left behind evidence revealing his obsession with his crime. During a search of his apartment, a copy of The Ultimate Evil was found. It had several bookmarks at the points where Maury discussed the church murder. It seemed the killer had enjoyed reading about his own crime. A handwritten suicide note, written in 2016 when investigators began re-examining his case, was also discovered inside. The note made no mention of the victim. After nearly 45 years, justice had caught up with the perpetrator, but he cowardly escaped conviction. Sadly, Arlis's father did not live to see this moment. He had passed away 3 months before the police arrived to arrest Stephen Crawford. Bruce Perry became a renowned psychiatrist in the field of child mental health. He worked with children suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and those who were victims of mass shootings and other serious crimes. Bruce even authored 3 books in his field. Little is known about his personal life. After 44 years, the mask finally fell. The killer was not a demon from another world or a member of a mysterious cult. He was the man who held the keys to the church. The man who was supposed to protect it. The monster they had been searching for everywhere had been hiding in plain sight all along.